Hi, it's me, Lindsay. I'm here continuing the talk about gauge in crochet and knitting patterns. There are some common mistakes that people make when they're measuring gauge on their swatch or on their pattern. The first mistake people tend to make is not treating the swatch the way they're going to treat the finished item. So what I mean by that is maybe like you make your swatch and right off the hook you start measuring. Well, are you going to use like your finished item right off the hook? So like let's say it's a blanket and you plan on machine washing it. So take your swatch and machine wash it, and that'll give you a better idea of what size your stitches are going to be in the finished item. If you're planning on steam blocking your shawl, steam block your swatch before you measure your gauge. That's going to give you your most accurate measurements. Another mistake people make is they measure gauge over like an inch or 2 inches. Really, you want to measure over like 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches to get an accurate gauge. So you're like, what does it matter? One of the first pieces I ever designed was a filet crochet matzo cover for Crochet World magazine. And if you look at it, it's a beautiful piece. I'm very proud of it. It's a rectangle. I'm not sure I've ever actually told anybody this. When I designed it, I designed it to be a square, but it wound up too long by the time I finished. Now the reason for that was because I measured my row gauge over 1 inch. And so what looked like a certain number of stitches per inch, there was really a tiny amount of another row stuck in there. So if I'd measured over 4 inches, I would have realized that I had more rows in an inch than I thought. So you get a more accurate measurement if you go over 4 inches. I didn't know that at the time. I was newer, so I measured over 1 inch. I didn't realize, because sometimes it's really like tiny and you don't realize it's 1/4 of a stitch extra or 1/5 of a stitch. That's my other pet peeve about gauge. Unless you're knitting, don't measure gauge in half stitches. I'd much rather see a gauge like 14 stitches is 3.5 inches. I don't think a gauge like 12.5 stitches is equal to 4 inches is very helpful, especially in crochet, because how can you accurately measure half of a stitch? In knitting, it kind of works with stockinette stitch because the stockinette stitch V's are very even, so you can accurately see where half a stitch is. But it doesn't really work that way in crochet. So in crochet, I do not recommend measuring your gauge in half stitches or quarter stitches or anything like that. You can use 1/2 inches because that's a very clear line on your ruler or your tape measure, but no 1/2 inches. Doesn't work that way. Another issue that people have when measuring gauge is they use a different yarn. Just because you get a gauge with a certain worsted weight yarn doesn't mean you're going to get that exact gauge with a different worsted weight yarn. And you think like worsted weight is worsted weight, what's the difference? But really just the way the yarn is made, the twist, the ply can really affect your gauge. So you want to make sure when you're doing your gauge swatch to practice your gauge that you're using whatever yarn you plan on using in your finished project. Finally, the last mistake that I commonly see people make with gauge is they make their gauge swatch when they're first practicing the pattern. So when you're first practicing a new stitch pattern that you've never done before, you're very like focused and conscientious and like laser focused in on that stitch pattern and those instructions, and consequently you'll find you're crocheting a tiny bit tighter. Now that's fine, but then what happens is once you're into the actual like sweater or blanket or shawl or whatever it is you're making, you get used to the stitch pattern and you're more relaxed and your gauge changes. You end up crocheting more loosely or knitting more loosely than you did when you made the swatch. So as annoying as it might be, you might want to make one swatch just to practice the stitch pattern, and then once you're comfortable with it, make your gauge swatch and measure off of that. These are my top tips for when you're working with gauge and measuring gauge. If you want this and more crafty crochet knitting fun information, check out my website, thelindsaylife.com, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, or like me on Facebook.